Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today is April 5, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Keith. Is it B. Williams, middle initial B?
Yeah, I don't tend to dwell on the middle initial.
Okay, but I just want to know. Okay, Keith Williams, where in the heck are you calling in from?
I'm calling from Dundee, which is on the sort of northeast coast of Scotland, somewhere between Edinburgh and Aberdeen, where I've been living for nearly 30 years. So the bulk of my academic career has been in Scotland. At this particular university on the east coast.
How cool is that? The first question, Keith, is what's the best thing for a human being?
What's the best thing for a human being? Gosh, that's hitting me with a big philosophical question from the start. The best thing for a human being, I suppose, is to be as human as possible.
That's a great. I've never had that answer. To be as human as possible.
Yes.
That's brilliant. Okay, so what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
My favorite form of information, how it comes into me? Well, probably the written text still. I'm still living in the kind of pre-digital age, or at least in terms of, how I would prioritize reading. But I'm also a very visual person as well. So my interest in literature is often across that sort of transactional border between words and images, and I find it very difficult to kind of separate the two out, as it were.
Well, Keith, did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to, two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
A little bit of both. I mean, I have a kind of perhaps a false memory of suddenly knowing that I could read when I was at primary school. We had a little, we had these little books of fairy tales. So I was particularly fond of an illustrated version of the Gingerbread Man story.
Yeah.
And I think I just kind of looked at it so often, and I had it read to me so often, that suddenly, the squiggles on the page clicked into place and became intelligible. And that may be a kind of false memory. I don't know, but it was like suddenly being able to, decode the words as well as the pictures, and to kind of fit the two together.
It's really interesting that you said that, Keith, because I have this theory that most parents teach their kids how to read Finnegan's Wake by reading to them before they can read. So it becomes an ear experience more. But like you said, they're still staring at these squiggles. And it's sort of going, well, child, I'm going to read this book and you're going to look at pictures, but also there's these words on the page and I'm going to pronounce them to you, but you don't really know that word means that yet. So no. It's an amazing process of parents reading aloud to kids, because then reading becomes a solitaire experience in general. You don't read aloud most texts.
No, that's right. I mean, in the medieval monasteries, it would have been very unusual. The monks were one of the few sort of literate groups in society, but they almost never read in their heads. They would have been reading out loud, either to one another or just kind of collectively.
That it was a collective. It was amazing. So, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, I think we have to, really, don't we, to sort of function as a species, and to kind of understand ourselves. And we're gregarious. We're a social animal, so we need to be able to communicate and sort of understand and interpret our world. So it's all kind of grown out of that, I suppose, the sort of practical necessities of becoming what we are.
Is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
It's probably a bit of both, and I think it's reached a kind of overload situation in our current society. I think most of us sort of experience that sense of being overwhelmed with information, overwhelmed with data, and with so many different media and channels that might convey it to us, or intrude into our lives.
Really good, Keith. Thank you. Do thoughts create emotions?
Do thoughts create emotions? Well, I think they can do, but I think emotions can also create thoughts. It's probably a two-way process, isn't it? If you feel something, it may catapult you back in memory, or it may induce a kind of connection to something else. That's very Joycean, I think, isn't it? That sort of interactivity between thoughts and emotions, and the way that the one becomes invested in the other.
Yep. Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
don't know what I think until that's that's an interesting one to ponder. I don't know what I think until I've written it down, possibly.
Wow, that's good. I got to tell you, the great thing about being on live TV worldwide right now is that 40 years of my interviews mainly were audio only. And this has really changed since COVID and Zoom. And I don't know what I think. And you went like this and you touch your head and it's like, I don't know what I think until I scratch my head.
Yeah, that's probably what I was really saying.
Right. But this is amazing because
the anthropoid ape response.
Like if I scratch it, that will come out. But the examples are McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. Yes. So can humans think without language?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, being able to kind of recover that sense of thinking wordlessly that might have been there before you became sort of inducted into language. I mean, a portrait of the artist really starts just over the threshold of that. There's a sense there, isn't there, of something that may have happened before the the first words of the story.
Yes,
may have been pre-literate, and of course the word infant means unable to speak. We often forget that, really, that infants are those who are not yet not yet immersed in language, and not yet able to as it were understand or deploy it. But whether we think wordlessly before that or not is well, maybe that's one for the child psychologists to to dig away at.
Well, this is good, Keith, because you get it. I'm after your hunch, your guess. You like people say, well, that's a neuroscientist question. I goes, well, that's all right. Just what's your hunch or guess? So I appreciate you digging deep, because you also evoked this. I think it was in the New Yorker, an article recently that said these people are studying if children in the mother's womb can dream, or is dreaming happen when the child is out of the womb and having experience.
Yeah.
So whether it's like, oh, I need milk, I'm going to cry now, or I struggled out of my mother's womb, or I had a C-section and just flew out, who knows? But it reminded me of this thing you said, wordlessly, because I would say in the mother's womb, we're kind of wordless, but who knows? We might have words. And then like Robin Williams, the comedian, said, womb service. And then the infant, meaning unable to speak. Well, as soon as you come out of the womb, you're able to speak and sing, but you're not doing it in like our It's like Esperanto or something.
That's right. That's right.
Finneganese.
Yeah. Well, apparently they say that children have the capacity to produce any sound in, we're born with the innate capacity to produce any sound in any of the world's languages. And that's the kind of hardware that's sort of, innate in the human vocal apparatus and brain. But, we're obviously born into, particular societies which, kind of expose us to particular languages. And that seems to be the sort of software that gets played on the hardware, and which also begins to kind of take up the memory and take up sort of the muscle functions of the voice, so that it tends to get kind of set in a particular way because of how it's activated. So we probably lose that innate capacity to do lots of other things with sound, unless, of course, we're brought up multilingually, or we make an effort to learn other languages as we grow up. And it's obviously much harder to do that as an adult, partly because the sort of muscle memory of your own vocal apparatus has got kind of set in particular ways.
Well, I love your word muscle function, muscle memory, I've heard, but muscle function. And again, Keith, you must have ESP, because Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Do you mean in terms of coming across situations where you can't express something, or
you're in line at a store and you can't communicate with the clerk or something, or with a family member, some kind of communication breakdown? What do you do?
Yeah, I think I would sort of step back and try and find another way of saying it, or another way of kind of communicating, and hope that eventually language will kind of catch up and sort of supply the sort of key to that. But I think we're all confronted with situations which are sort of inexpressible because they're so sort of emotionally overwhelming, or so devastating, that language appears to fail, just because of the impact, the shock, or whatever. And maybe it just takes our feelings and our abilities to sort of catch up with that, as we process it. I don't know,
Well, it was good what you said, Keith, because one guy said, "What do you do when language breaks down?" He goes, "Group hug." Now that's more a tactile, emotional thing. But then you said this line, "Language will catch up." So after you do the group hug, you might go, "Okay, let's try again to suss this out." Breakdown. So it is funny that spoken word kind of is. In general, your observations of humans, are we more thinking or more feeling beings?
Well, I think we're both, really, aren't we? We're sort of amphibious in that respect. And I know exactly what you mean, or what your friend meant, that sometimes a human touch, a hug, or whatever, is the only way of expressing empathy, or expressing a sense of being in a kind of common predicament of some kind. If you've been recently bereaved, or whatever. And I think language only catches up because our ability to sort of process and perhaps come to terms with something is sort of achieved through that. or it's one of the kind of main tools for doing it.
It's amazing because I was at a film festival and kind of leery still of COVID and germs, and I kind of, everybody wants to shake your hand or hug you, and I sort of do the a fist bump, and I did the fist bump, and this woman would not do the fist bump. She held her hand, said, "No, you have to shake my hand." Like she would not go to that, and I went, "Oh, okay." Like it was sort of a total gestural move. There was no words. It was just like,
yes. I suppose you can't really feel that much with the back of your knuckles.
These are two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Gosh, yeah, it's certainly a function of whatever passes for a soul in us. Whatever kind of embodied consciousness we have, as beings, and whether or not that's sort of a product of our organic nature, or whether it's something else. The kind of the jury's still out for me.
Yeah. And the second Turing question is, can machines think?
Yeah, well, they could certainly. I mean, the Turing test is, I think, more about machines giving the appearance of thinking than about thinking as such. When I was listening to a rather interesting, unfortunately, I've forgotten I think he was a neuropsychologist. I've forgotten his name, but he was arguing that, in a sense, artificial intelligence will never be able to think. It'll never be self-conscious, because self-consciousness is a product of the situation of, it's a function of human embodiment. It's kind of wired into us, as it were. And if the only way that a machine could ever think is if it were in a comparable sort of position of consciousness arising through its kind of its organs and its connectivity with the world, and so on. I probably summarized that really badly, but it was an interesting idea, I thought. That
no, you summarized
the function of embodiment, which kind of goes against
right.
many
You
of the
you summarized it well. It's an ongoing, like one person I heard says, AI is in its infant stage and it's our job to raise it well. And so what's going to happen with it? I mean, to me, when we invented spoken word and printed word, we invented AI. But the words take on a world of their own, and they think, and they have emotion, but we don't. All language is metaphorical. So that's the but we think words mean something because we invented etymology. Like you said, infant means unable to speak. But this is I haven't really gone here, but I want to with you because you're so brilliant. And this is, Turing also said, what we want is a machine that can learn from experience. Now, who is the we there? Is he saying what all humans want, or us, brainiacs who are studying this? And what's your take on that? What we want is a machine that can learn from experience. Any thoughts on that line?
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of collective first person, isn't it? Is he referring to the kind of the geeky desires of the boffins, as it were, or is he kind of is he embracing the whole species there?
Yeah,
it's not so easy to tell, really, is it? Although I think he was quite he was a very interesting figure, Alan Turing, and probably a lot more empathic and human than the stereotype of the the sort of computer genius
that we get, like Hollywood telling us.
Yes.
You mean that we get Hollywood telling us his personality? Then we believe the movies. We don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. So then here's the McLuhan line. I'm very curious. I'm going to read you the line. I'm going to tell you what I think it means. Doesn't mean I even know it's right or wrong, but everybody experiences far more than they understand.
Mm.
Yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. So the
Mm.
way I figure that's what's going on there is he's trying to distinguish between experience and understanding. And he's saying if the kid comes in from the cold, the parent can go, "Don't touch the stove, you'll burn your hand." That's experience. The parent could go, "I'm going to teach you the dynamics of heat." That's understanding. You can get your hand really close to the stove, rub them together, and you get your hands warm. So, what's your take on this McLuhan line? Everybody experiences far more than they understand, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. Yeah, human beings I suppose we're all constantly exposed to, kind of complex situations and cause and effect and so on that we don't really, we either don't really understand as individuals or we don't really understand as a species. But we've got to be able to, as it were, like the kid that touches the flame or is warned off from touching the flame but doesn't understand, the kind of thermodynamics behind it. We've got to find some kind of modus operandi that stops us from getting burnt or enables us to enables us to function in relation to our environment or our own mortality.
But then it's interesting because does the kid learn better by burning his hand a little, or does he learn better by the parent negative going, "Don't tell me what to do. I want to find," like T.S. Eliot said, I had the experience but missed the meaning.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
heavy too. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Yeah. Do I more pursue happiness than meaning? Yeah, I'd need to put that into a kind of context, I think. I mean, I think I certainly strive to be, strive to a reasonable level of kind of contentment,
Yeah.
as it were. But I think the notion of sort of, the more kind of hedonistic notions of happiness are kind of slightly fallacious or even dangerous in
Yeah.
themselves. And I think that because happiness is only one of a kind of whole spectrum of emotions, you can't expect to be sort of stranded, in a kind of ecstatic state, permanently. It wouldn't be good for you. It wouldn't be human. So I think in that sense, placing emotions within a spectrum of understanding that kind of relates them to other feelings, other states is very important. So yeah, meaning perhaps in that sense.
Really well done because I got it from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning tends to last. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away, and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Yeah, again, I don't know. I mean, it's possibly a bit of both.
Yeah.
Certainly, the way that consciousness functions, the way that it's, the stream of consciousness unfolds, is down to, changes in our perception and sort of movements in our ideas and so on. So it's certainly kind of created or shaped, by factors that are both kind of internal and external.
Yeah.
And which we only partly have control over, but which nonetheless, kind of give it a direction and and a momentum.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Is there a thoughtometer that we can?
Hey, you answered the question with the question. You win. That's what the series is all about: inventing new questions.
Be great if we had some device to measure the speed of thought. I'm sure Kurt Vonnegut probably wrote about one.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Bringing up him.
Did he not write a story about a device that can kind of measure intelligence?
I don't know, but I wish I did. I love Kurt.
Yeah. And I remember vaguely the context of the story is that, other animal species who've basically persuaded humans that they are less intelligent than them in order to manipulate them, want to destroy this device because it would give the whole game away.
Audre Lorde, the poet, said you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer said you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
For dismantling the master's house?
Well, here's the thing, just to put it in context. Basically, I'm asking you, what tool do you gravitate towards? But you can add the word new. And then because I open these questions with cue quotes sometimes, you can apply the quote if you want. You don't have to.
Yes. Yeah, it might take me a while to think that one through.
Yeah.
What new tool? Yeah. I mean, the problem is that sort of mastery is something that sort of, I suppose, permeates the whole of a society. That, I mean, Foucault would argue that it's there at lots and lots of different levels in these delegated forms. So, I don't think we're all necessarily inhabiting a house that belongs to, this thing called the master. But there is something called mastery that we need to be awfully careful about, and which, we should try to sort of, have a critical understanding of, and certainly in terms of the way in which we're sort of complicit with it.
That's good. Understanding of mastery. Yeah. That reminds me of the subgenius. They say, pull the wool over your own eyes. What new toy do you suggest?
New toy? Gosh, I'm not sure. I've recently, for therapeutic purposes, really got into jigsaw puzzles.
Oh, nice.
They're not exactly a new toy. But the thing that got me really into it, I mean, I kind of won't go into the emotional context that kind of precipitated this, but the actual jigsaw, the individual jigsaw, funnily enough, is a jigsaw of Joyce's Ulysses, which was.
You mean the picture itself?
Yes, it's a kind of it's a kind of map of the text, if you like, that sort of spatializes it, but which also kind of moves across the time of the day as well.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, it was created by a colleague of mine, because the university here has an art college, which we collaborate with a lot in various ways. But the individual colleague, who's called Michael Kirkham, created this jigsaw of Ulysses, working with another Joyce scholar before I actually met him. But if I'd known in advance, it would have been a great project to be involved with. However, it's also a really interesting way of understanding the text, and seeing the text in a kind of spatialized but also sort of temporally unfolding form.
Keith, is this jigsaw puzzle physical, tactile, or is it online, or both?
It's it's certainly physically available. I don't know whether there's a digital version of it, but I understand from friends of mine that you can actually subscribe to digital jigsaws, and sort of move the pieces around on screen. So I think it would be there would be that interchangeability about it. And you know, I think
yeah, it's a great answer to the toy. What new toy do you suggest? A jigsaw puzzle of Ulysses.
panoramic jigsaw of Ulysses.
Oh, it's panoramic. That's good.
Yes, that's right. Well, I think Joyce was very interested in panoramas. You know, he references them, you know, in all sorts of ways. And you know, there's a sense of Ulysses being a kind of moving panorama that's made up of lots of, you know, sort of mobile fragments that, you know, the reader has to kind of assemble. So this is kind of pushing that beyond metaphor into the sort of literal.
Yeah. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Oddly, I don't tend to worry when I go to bed. I worry when I wake up in the middle of the night, which is a very irritating habit. You know, because I generally go to bed not feeling that anxious, and then, you know, the kind of flight fight thing kind of kicks in when I you know, when I wake up from my first sleep,
Yeah,
as people would have called it in the past, and that's when the, you know, the circuits start firing.
Well, McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions.
Yes.
So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions.
Mm-hmm.
So, Keith, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The other hat that I wear as a scholar, as an academic, is researching into early science fiction. You know, so I published quite a lot on the scientific romance period, and specifically on H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
But we're also in the process of researching the work of a sort of lost science fiction writer who was born in Scotland, but, you know, basically published in California, in San Francisco in the 1880s and 90s. But his work is astonishingly prescient about kind of new technological media, which were either only just beginning to come into existence at that point, or which he's sort of anticipating. But I think the people that actually invent these new technological media aren't necessarily the ones with the greatest insight into their you know, social, political, or cultural impacts. So I often quote to my students a couple of you know, a couple of as it were, references to that lack of insight. One on the part of one of the Lumiere brothers, you know, Auguste, who wrote to Louis and said, oh, you know, this cinematograph thing, it'll be a 9 days wonder. It'll all be over in 6 months' time. And then Alexander Graham Bell, who of course was a Scot, who when asked what he thought the future of the telephone was, said, I can see a future. I can see a time in the future when every town in America will have one of these, which is
wow,
sort of limited in terms of, you know, the kind of explosion of human consciousness that, you know, moving images and telecommunications are going to unleash. But writers and artists, you know, writers and artists are right on the case. You know, you can see that in Wells's work. You can see that in the work of this you know, this ghost of futures past, as we like to call him, this science fiction writer that we're researching and republishing, whose name is Robert Duncan Milne.
Robert Duncan Mill. Yeah. So a lot of questions arrived from what you just said. The first is the Lumieres. This will be gone. The newspaper in Paris that reviewed the first movie screenings by the Lumieres, they said, now you'll never die.
Yes.
which is perfect because that is like, you could have a website and you die and your website might live on in your YouTube videos. It's like you're still alive.
Absolutely. Yeah, you'll be a kind of, a sort of zombie presence in these media. Yeah, that's right. Well,
But
again,
go ahead.
I was going to say again, Milne's work is full of, and Wells's to some extent, they're full of notions of technological ghostliness, of forms of electronic spectrality that are going to kind of, fill up this this future world.
Yeah. But you're saying Lumiere was this end. He's saying this will be gone, in Alexander Graham Bell saying, no, this is going to live on. That's sort of this. Yeah.
That's right. At least Bell says that, in the future, every town in America will have one of these.
Yeah.
There's no sense there that, the telephone will become a kind of domestic object, or that we'll be carrying them around in our pockets,
right.
kind of telepresencing around the world, at the touch of a few buttons. So yeah, I mean, again, it's very limited. The technologists and the inventors and the scientists don't necessarily have the insight into, how the the future is going to be changed by new ways of seeing or hearing or displacing human presence and agency, from one side of the planet to the other.
But Keith, are you saying, just to be clear, you're saying because they don't, that's why the kind of normal consumer, or even the critical thinking consumer, whether academic or the normal person on the street, we humans tend to ignore that the artists are broadcasting these hidden effects. Why do we ignore these hidden psychic effects being broadcast to us?
Yes, I think that the thought experiments of writers, where they try out, they try on new inventions for size, by kind of imagining worlds where, the effects of those discoveries, will be kind of endemic or exponential or whatever.
Yeah,
they're trying to sort of map out their potential consequences, not necessarily in an alarmist way, but sort of, it's a kind of imaginative inoculation against, possible risks and dangers. And we sort of, if science and the scientific imagination of writers are not in conversation, then, that happens at our peril, I think.
Yeah.
And the other thing I should mention about Dundee is that it's not necessarily that well known that it's actually the city of Frankenstein as well, because Mary Shelley lived here for nearly 2 years when she was a teenager, and just before she wrote Frankenstein. So Frankenstein isn't just the sort of urtext of science fiction, the point when science fiction kind of buds off from the Gothic. It's also the original critique, if you like, of a kind of patriarchal form of scientific knowledge and practice that sort of, essentially detaches itself from, from self-knowledge and emotional intelligence and so on, and kind of unleashes this thing on the world without any real forethought. The Promethean subtitle of the text, but it's also written by a teenage girl, who has absolutely no chance of involving herself in scientific knowledge and practice, by kind of studying at university or whatever at that time.
She's sort of like, she's going, if you guys continue this is what's going to happen. And it did.
Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
There's one conversation, particular letter in Frankenstein, which kind of gives the whole game away, if you like, in terms of Mary Shelley's sense of exclusion and resentment towards, the kind of skewing of science by kind of by gender, by patriarchal exclusionism. When Frankenstein's girlfriend writes to him and says, I had a conversation with your dad last night about, you know, what the profession that my brother should go into. And we had a real argument around whether he should go into the law or whether he should become a gentleman farmer, you know, because I think law is kind of corrupt. It's used for, you know, for some fairly nefarious purposes. And Frankenstein's father sort of puts her down by saying, well, you know, Elizabeth, that's a really interesting point of view, but perhaps you should go on and become an advocate. And, you know, the letter sort of ends with, and that put an end to the conversation, because Frankenstein's father knows full well that she's got no chance in hell of being able to enter any of these professions, you know, as a young girl, any more than Mary Shelley could have become, you know, a professional scientist and studied science at university, like her protagonist does.
Have feminists hoiked up what you just told me there? Have they utilized that and said, look at this, what she's saying? Or is that something that's not a known in the academic world study of Frankenstein?
I'm not sure how much that particular point has been dwelt on. But, you know, clearly Mary Shelley and the way that she sort of channels the ideas of her mother, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft in particular. I mean, she never knew her mother, but, you know, she was certainly immersed in her mother's ideas, I think, and the sort of legacy that they left in the world. Feminists are very clearly aware of that and have, you know, built all sorts of, you know, sort of arguments and theories around it.
Keith, just aside really quick, do you know Theodore Sturgeon's book, More Than Human?
I've heard of it. I've not actually read it, I have to confess.
I'm very curious because it was Frank Zappa and Phil Lesh from the Grateful Dead's favorite book. And I'm always curious why in the heck, because I mean, that's sort of, we're engaged in now this more than humanness. That was really deep what you told me. I really appreciate that. So do artists have moral obligation?
Yeah, I think no more than anyone else, though. I think we've all got moral obligations. Maybe because they're able to reach a wide audience, they need to be particularly careful about, you know, how they communicate and what, you know, what their messages might be.
Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Yeah, that's interesting. Some old ideas get recycled and get reborn, you know, and some of them can be particularly dangerous, I think. But also, you know, others can be precisely what we do need to retrieve.
It's almost like you knew the roots of my question. John Cage says, I can't understand why people are frightened of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones. And then Charles Kettering said, people are very open-minded about new things as long as they're exactly like the old ones. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
My earliest memory ever. That's interesting. I think I have a memory of sort of gnawing on a cucumber of all things, because I was particularly fond of sort of, you know, cucumber when I was a kid. I still like salads now, but I don't know whether that's actually down to a snapshot that one of my uncles took of me sitting on a table at my grandmother's, you know, chewing on a cucumber. There's nothing Freudian about all of this.
That's all right. I love cucumbers too, and they're great to grow in gardens. So is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Gosh, yeah. Well, it can be both, I think, really.
Yeah.
I mean, the old cliche is that, you know, you'll live long and well if you have a good digestion and a bad memory. If it's the other way around.
Oh, is it really? That's a do you know who said that? Good digestion
and a bad memory.
live longer.
Well,
Good.
you might have a more enjoyable life, as it were.
What you know? What I learned is you live longer if you complain and gossip
Ah,
because you get it out of your system. You know,
sure. Don't bottle it up.
good digestion and bad memory. That's amazing. Because my two heroes, Zappa and Joyce, both had duodenal ulcers. You know,
Yeah, they did. I actually had them myself a few years ago.
yeah,
Although in Joyce's case, I think it was probably from an infection, whereas mine was from a medical misdiagnosis. Really, I was given the wrong drugs for a condition that I had, and I wasn't given a sort of stomach protector. So my ulcers won't recur, but they were duodenal, and they bloody
duodenal. Yeah, I always mispronounce it. But you know, it's funny because I kind of not cured mine, but the most effective remedy was juicing cabbage. And it sounds great, but
well.
20 years ago I started doing it. So you throw in carrots
Mm,
or ginger and all this other greens along
mm,
with cabbage. And I haven't gotten a cold in 20 years, and it pretty much
mm.
got rid of my any stomach queasiness, you know what
Yeah,
I
yeah. Well, the Germans swear by sauerkraut, of course,
that's it.
as the best thing for your what do they call it? Your gut biome, because it's fermented and it's
Yep.
live and all this kind of stuff. Well, I quite like it, but you know, hopefully my ulcers won't recur whether I eat sauerkraut regularly or not.
Yeah. Good.
But
Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
yeah, someone within my immediate family. Well, I think my father had a lot of influence on who I became, or who I've become, rather. I better not put
Yeah.
myself in past tense, not quite yet. Because he was just so interested in so many things. He was really polymathic in his in his engagement with the world. Although he narrowly missed out on higher education, he narrowly missed out on going to university because of a kind of quirk of our educational system back in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And
What was his career?
well, he actually became a kind of engineer, really, and well, what we would have called here at one time a draftsman.
Yeah.
Who was involved in sort of designing engineering components in mining and in the aviation industry. One of his proudest achievements was having designed part of I think the front nose wheel on the undercarriage of Concorde.
Wow.
But he also worked on some military designs as well back in the 1960s.
Very good. And then same question outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact on you.
Yeah. Well, I suppose there's all kinds of figures from my reading who had a massive impact on me, but I suppose maybe the person that kind of set me off in the Joycean direction in particular was Richard Ellman.
Yeah.
I did a master's in Oxford, and I took a specialist module on Joyce with Richard Ellman. I was probably one of the last cohorts of students that he taught, before he retired and passed away. But he in the subtlest kind of way, he left a real sort of mark on my interests, and he's a figure that kind of hovers over a lot of what I do, I think.
What's the years approximately you're taking one class with them or a few?
Yeah, it was a specialist module. I think it either lasted the equivalent of what we would call a semester now.
Yeah.
possibly a whole year. I can't really remember, but we're talking about sort of 1980, 82 to 83 there, or possibly 83 to 84. So dim and distant past for a lot of people.
I'm so jealous because he was born in Highland Park, Michigan, and I'm from Flint, Michigan, and he was born on the same date as me, the Ides of March, March 15.
Yeah, I was born on the 15th of March as well.
Oh, right.
That's quite a coincidence.
Amazing. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Well, my parents were both Welsh, from the Rhondda in South Wales, which is a very famous coal mining area.
Yep.
And there's a lot of, I suppose, religious nonconformity in that area. So I remember being sent to sort of Methodist Sunday school as a child.
Yeah.
But the most of my childhood was actually spent in a village in England, where the local school was Church of England in actual fact. So it was kind of an established church rather than, one of these more, in inverted commas, sort of dissident chapel traditions. So I suppose, I was kind of pinged around between the two to some extent.
Do you pray?
Not really. It's if you give it the word prayer, then you're giving it a very sort of specific identity. But I think that sometimes your thoughts seem to be directed towards something, or you're kind of, well, not broadcasting to some sort of creator entity or whatever, but you're pondering things which are sort of moving outwards towards those big unanswered questions, or maybe unanswerable questions.
Very good. Yeah. If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Well, certainly not you're going to burn in hell or something.
Finally, someone said that.
You're in the wrong place, mate. You were destined for downstairs. I'm not sure, really.
Yeah. Well, 90% of people say you did a good job.
You did what you could in the time available.
There you go.
I'm going to have that chiseled on my tombstone.
Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know whether I believe in some kind of abstract entity called evil, but it's certainly a powerful term for describing certain kinds of human behavior and certain kinds of inhumanity. And obviously in the 21st century and beyond, we've got some examples of it on the most industrial, if not, kind of planetary scale. But, I don't believe that these things are necessarily diabolically inspired. They may be the result of some kind of failure in the way that we inculcate or nurture, sort of mutual empathy.
Yeah.
Or a situation that dehumanizes people. Yeah.
Well, you really get it, Keith, because it's basically the hidden question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So again, it's a lot of prompts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Yes. Yeah. Acknowledge your enemy and you empower them. That seems a psychological point to me, because it's about giving certain people or certain tendencies, perhaps too much headroom, kind of allowing them kind of to colonize your thoughts or your sense of self. And the other quotation that you gave just now about some people needing enemies,
Yeah.
I think I've come across some people who seem to require that sort of dynamic. Who kind of as it were find having enemies and a kind of a psychological necessity almost.
Totally. It's amazing. And it's Walt Whitman even says, I no doubt deserve my enemies. That's even like one step where it's almost like when people deal with their enemies, they'll go like, well, it's sort of like capital punishment. It's like, don't become your enemy. If someone kills somebody, we shouldn't kill them. But some people go, no, we should. So that actually leads into this is Nassim Taleb said, games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is.
Yes.
Villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. And Gregory Bates, an anthropologist, says if the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, wow, I did something morally and socially wrong? So again, it's a lot of prompts, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Does it work? You'd hope that rehabilitation works.
Yeah.
You'd hope that forcing someone to kind of confront what they've done and to kind of put themselves in the shoes of their victim, you'd hope that would work, because I'm not sure that punishment does. I mean, except in that purely brutal sense of rubbing someone out.
Yeah.
So that they're no longer a physical problem. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I'm sort of minded to invoke, that concept that philosophers use of sort of moral luck.
Moral. What was the second word? Luck.
Moral luck.
Luck.
Yeah. What they seem to refer to there is the the kind of circumstances into which we're born, or which kind of support us, making it less likely that we might transgress, or less likely that we would offend. And I suppose Daniel Defoe would phrase it in the words of Moll Flanders, give me not poverty, lest I steal.
Right, lest I steal. Oh my God.
In other words, if you're poor, you're more likely to be sort of pushed into the position, where you're at least tempted to, break the law at that level, perhaps out of necessity.
Yeah.
This is why British juries in the early 19th century started, refusing to convict, children who'd stolen a loaf of bread, because theft was still a hanging offence. So if someone's stolen bread because they're starving, you're not going to find them guilty if you have any sense of compassion.
So that's what I think about stealing my bike. Someone steals my bicycle, they probably need it more than me. Go ahead. What are you going to do? It's sad, but I really get what you're saying. And my friend used to say this thing, crime of passion. Like, you kill this lover and it's out of passion. Well, does that rationale it? Well, wow, that's heavy. So Joyce, James, go ahead. You want to add something?
No, please carry on.
James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin. Volta Cinema. I mean, you talk about, you've written about Joyce in cinema, and I'm really impressed because there's a lot of crossover. But, you know, basically what I heard is Joyce said, I'm out of here. This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? And then years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Yeah, it's a curious paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's one of our better known British stand-up comics was on a program on the radio where they were talking about, sort of a new generation of sort of 3D films or 3D culture, and his quip was, well, has nobody noticed that the whole world is in 3D? Why is it that when we can kind of replicate or represent, a phenomenon like that that's kind of wired into human perception, that we become so excited about it?
Yeah.
But our mundane experience of it is not something that we particularly reflect on or value, except when it's kind of reflected back at us in that way. So I suppose there is something about the way in which it changes our way of seeing, or the way it changes our understanding of how we see.
Yeah. Of seeing and the understanding of seeing. It reminded me of I have salons on photography, and I use Billy Wilder's quote, black and white is more true than color.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, dude, we live in a color world. How can black and white be more true? Now, most people go, well, it's less information, so you get to the essence. My take is, it's because we've seen photographs and films in black and white for so long that register as more true than Technicolor.
Yeah, I think there is a sort of a curious paradox about how we invest in, say, the history of documentary film, which was all, in the past appears to be in black and white, particularly if you represent it in this apparently authentic and unmediated form.
Yeah.
And yet what we're actually talking about, is a kind of cultural moment where, a particular medium happens to be very widespread and very prominent, and begins to kind of colonize how we think about the world. Media archaeologists call it a media cultural imaginary, which is constantly being sort of updated by the new media forms that we're exposed to, and which become kind of internalized. So even when we're not literally looking through lenses or watching screens or hearing transmissions or whatever, we've sort of absorbed all of that, and it kind of conditions and shapes how we think and interact.
Is that three words? Media cultural. What was the third word?
A media cultural imaginary.
Oh, imaginary. That is amazing.
Yeah, it's a rather jargonizing term that's used a lot in in particular academic context to relate to how a particular sort of mental formation functions.
Well, it reminds me of what we call the android meme. Yeah. It is that what it is our inventions, say movie, have hidden psychic effects, and then they take on a life of their own and humans disappear. And so we don't go, I had this dream last night, and you can't describe it in words, but you try by going, it was like a movie.
Yes. an internal image track of some kind. Right. Yeah. mean, you can clearly see it in Joyce's work. You know, the way that he describes, you know, the stream of consciousness, or you know, the interior monologues in Ulysses. They're full of sort of imagery, tropes, even in some senses technological terms, you know, from the media that he was exposed to in his lifetime.
Totally. He's just repeating advertising. The same thing. Zappa just repeats advertising and lines from church, like Joyce does it too. And then, you know, you get it regurgitated in another sense. And so tell us, Keith, like, what's the tipping point when you pursue, what are you studying in high school and college, and you go, that's what I want to be, an educator. That's what I want to be, a writer.
Sure.
And
When you cross that Rubicon,
yeah, Rubicon, that's the word. Yeah, Rubicon or tipping point. Yeah. For your calling. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think I probably, because I was so you know, my parents didn't have, you know, a lot of money. We weren't brought up in particularly well-heeled circumstances. So a lot of the sort of, you know, the kind of richness in my life really came from ideas and came from wanting to know things. You know, I remember standing on the sort of the front bumper of my dad's car when I was about 5 or 6 or something, and telling a small group of other kids about dinosaurs, you know, about evolution. So there was clearly a kind of an urge, a desire to, you know, to kind of narrate and to transmit information and to, as it were, share these interesting ideas with other people and with the world. So I don't know whether that was the tipping point, or whether, you know, something, whether I arrived at a more kind of conscious decisions later on. Probably a little bit of both. You know, the kind of portrait of the artist as a young teacher kind of syndrome, as it were, where something's already kind of there in an embryonic form, and which tends to kind of get confirmed by your subsequent experiences into a sort of repeating and an intensified pattern that's, you know, vocational, I suppose.
Yeah, vocational. But Keith, just back to your phrase, wanting to know things. You think that's more DNA from your mom and dad, or more on your own, this wanting to know things?
Yeah, it's certainly, as I said, my father was intensely curious about everything, and I think, you know, if he had relived his life in a different way, he would probably have gone to university and studied, I don't know, politics, philosophy, and economics, or possibly even history. Whereas, you know, he was steered into a technical pathway, you know, out of necessity, really, and because he was also pretty good with practical things. You know, he was a mechanic when he was in the army, so he sort of built on that. But you know, that side to him, that sort of burning curiosity, is something that I definitely inherited. But I think that the world of ideas and the world of sort of, you know, history and myths and art and so on was a kind of alternative to that sense of, well, you know, relatively not poverty as such, but, you know, relatively tight circumstances when I was growing up.
Yeah. In Keith, what did you study in college? What was your specialty?
Yeah, I actually did my BA was in it was a BA in English literature and language, really.
Yeah.
So, you know, I had, although we studied you know, literature really from English literature from its beginnings up to, you know, what would have been the kind of mid-ish 20th century at that point. I also did parallel courses, you know, in Anglo-Saxon and in Middle English as well, and to a certain extent in Renaissance English too, although that wasn't kind of taught in a formal linguistic way to us. So I know a lot about, well, a reasonable amount about language history as it kind of relates to, the Germanic tongue that you and I are talking to each other at the moment. It's, it's Latin, it's Norman French superstructure. But my master's, I was unsure what direction to take my studies in between the BA and the MLit, so I did a master's in 20th century literature in Oxford, and that's where I encountered Richard Ellman and where my Joycean interests, because I'd already studied Joyce as an undergraduate, were sort of concretized and as it were intensified. But I was also my doctorate, my DPhil as they call them in Oxford, wasn't actually on Joyce. It was on documentary writing. So there was a connection between literature and other media in that, because you can't study British and to a certain extent American documentarism in the 20s and 30s without being aware of film documentary or radio documentary or whatever. It's all part of a kind of an interconnected skein of sort of cultural movement. But Joyce was nonetheless in the background of all of that, because one of the major figures that I focused on in the British context was very obviously George Orwell, who was obsessed with Joyce as a young writer in his formative years as a writer, and who even attempted to write like Joyce in one of his early novels.
Which one?
It's got a really odd title. It's called A Clergyman's Daughter, but it contains one very long chapter, which is kind of written in the style of the Circe episode in Ulysses. And someone once described it as like reading Down and Out in Paris and London as kind of rewritten by James Joyce.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
That's a fairly accurate description of how it reads, So it's laid out like this kind of surreal play stroke film script, where the kind of the internal psychology of the principal character is sort of externally registered as all these extraordinary kind of transformations and visions and so on, but very much like the Circe episode in Ulysses itself. And one or two of the earlier chapters as well, because the character has some kind of bump on the head or whatever and loses her memory, and she has to kind of relearn language and relearn, as it were, her own sort of consciousness and personality from scratch. So it sort of reads a bit like, that particular chapter reads a bit like kind of rewinding to the beginning of a portrait of the artist, even though it's actually happening to an adult mind that's kind of lost its bearings, had its memory and its perceptions wiped, and language gradually kind of comes back to it. So we don't think of Orwell as an experimental writer, and we wouldn't, his popular image is a million miles away from Joyce's, and yet there is this Joycean anxiety of influence, if you like, in behind Orwell's style and persona, which I think is really fascinating.
Keith, is that known in Joyce studies? Orwell's obsession with Joyce?
To some extent. I mean, I've published one or two articles on it myself. So there's a long article in the James Joyce Quarterly from the 90s, I think. It's a double length one, so it's quite a long article, which kind of looks at George Orwell in the British context and James Agee in the American context as both representative, the most representative documentary writers on their respective sides of the Atlantic, but the kind of common factor between them is this sort of influence from Joyce, this sort of understanding that, you know, no form of representation is entirely identical with the real. You know, they're all constructions of some sort, and that seems to be one of the major takeaways that both of these writers derive from Joyce. You know, is that sense that even documentarism, even this highly sort of apparently highly objective and transparent way of engaging with the world is really a construction in words, you know, or an artificial medium of some kind.
So you're saying documentary writing, you're talking about the narration over the documentary, or the narration under the pictures. That's what you focused on, that written narration for documentaries.
No, not necessarily. I'm talking about the sort of well, I'm partly talking about that because, of course, you know, documentary film does have that kind of narrative component to it, and certainly in a British context, a lot of contemporary writers were involved with the documentary film movement. So, you know, you've got W.H. Auden's commentaries on Night Mail and Coalface and so on. But I'm also talking about the way that, you know, writers, eyewitness writers like George Orwell, who are sort of, you know, visiting the distressed areas in the north of England and so on, are bearing kind of personal testimony to the facts of conditions and, as it were, reporting back on them to a readership who they expect, as it were, to you know, engage with that information and perhaps, you know, act on it politically.
On a newspaper form or on a movie form? You're saying they're bearing witness.
Yes, I mean, in Orwell's case, I mean, Orwell doesn't really write film scripts as such, but
he's writing in newspapers.
Well, yeah, he's writing short pieces of reportage which are based on his, you know, his experiences in, you know, as an imperial policeman out in India and so on.
Gotcha.
But also short articles about, you know,
right,
what it feels like being a tramp, or what it feels like being, you know, hospitalized if you're a member of the, you know, the working class in Paris or somewhere like that. But I suppose the two key documentary texts, you know, the two major pieces of reportage by Orwell are Down and Out in Paris and London.
Yeah.
You know, his account of being, you know, sort of homeless and unemployed, and then The Road to Wigan Pier, which is, you know, a kind of commissioned documentary which he writes for the Left Book Club about conditions in the distressed areas in the north of England.
Yeah.
And which does contain a lot of, I mean, it's not a film as such, but it contains a lot of documentary photographs.
Gotcha.
It's, you know, a bit like Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which I suppose is the equivalent in the American context.
That's really good. You really sussed that out well, because there were a couple things I wanted to go into there. Was but before we go into Joyce and H.G. Wells a little, a screenwriting teacher told me that a great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film or great art is when you can clearly not see the intention.
Yeah.
What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing one of your articles or books?
Yes. Intention and the end product aren't necessarily, you know, don't necessarily coincide completely, because I often find that you know, we were talking earlier about not really understanding your own thoughts until you write them down.
Yeah.
I think that when I write an academic article, I often don't quite know what I think about the subject until I've sort of, you know, written several drafts and, you know, worked out the sort of logic and the unexpected twists sometimes in my own arguments. I generally have I generally have a sort of, a big idea of some kind, but pursuing it, taking it for a long walk can often lead you, through some sort of unexpected topography and conditions.
Really well put. McLuhan also says that everything we invent extends some humanness. And it's funny because you said the best thing for a human being is to be as human as possible. Marshall also said the most human thing is our technologies, which most people go, what do you mean? Like the fact that we're extending our teeth with a knife and fork is the most human thing. The fact that we're extending our eyelid as with a shutter and a camera is the most human thing. And then even non-tangible, maybe philosophy or religion's extension of consciousness, who knows? So we extend these things. What does the writing utensil extend for you? What humanness, whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness do you extend with the writing utensil?
Yes. I suppose it's a way of embodying thought, isn't it? A way of encoding thought. But I entirely agree with your, what you summarized from McLuhan about, technology as a sort of prosthetic, human perception, and human understanding. But I think there's also, I mean, the other aspect of technology is that it's sort of morally neutral. It's what we do with it. It's the way that we extend, ourselves through it, which either, kind of develops and elaborates our humanity, or, the opposite to that, as it were.
Super heavy, because that's technological determinism is what they call McLuhan sometimes. He goes, no, he kind of is, because he said the Civil War was caused by the telegraph and the World War II was caused by the radio. And people go, the radio didn't cause World War II. Hitler caused radio by using the radio. And that's like, there's a real conundrum there when you say technology is morally neutral. Because in my opinion, you invent cinema, and 130 years of cinema is warfare. And we've ruined the world with TV, cars, and guns. I mean, that's a really bad bias that I have. But, my dad worked for GM and got the money to pay for me to go to college to learn that that's what happened. So what do you do about that?
An interesting feedback loop. When I say it's morally neutral, I mean up to the point where you start to apply it, where it starts to have an effect on the world, and it's the agendas behind that. Who uses it, who gets access to it. Whether media of communication are used to open the world up, or to sort of, as Orwell would have put it, to sort of create parallel worlds, where each radio set or each television network, becomes a kind of closed system that kind of controls people's thoughts essentially, and controls their access to reality, particularly to realities which are elsewhere, rather than ones that you can see or touch or feel. And I think that in Russia today, for example, 1984 seems to be a kind of manual of statecraft, rather than being read as a sort of caution against
cautionary tale. They use it as the manual. Have you ever seen the movies of Adam Curtis, Century of the Self, or this BBC guy?
Yes,
it's really interesting how he sort of makes movies that describe what you just talked about. And they're a little scary, and he's kind of in the middle of the road libertarian. He's not lefty, but lefties love it. They're like, oh my God. And all the power. This is good. I appreciate this. So I asked for 90 minutes, and we only got 5 minutes left. Can you go longer now?
You mean this evening?
Yeah, right now. Can you go 10 minutes longer, 20, 30?
I could probably run on for another 10, 15 minutes, something
okay,
like
let's go about 10 or 15.
If you're happy to do that.
But Keith, I would love to schedule a part 2 4-6 months down the line, because we hardly even, I usually get through 40 questions, and now I'm getting, because I'm going slower now and getting deeper, we got to number 15. So I wanted to jump into Joyce a little. So maybe we could go into Joyce a little. And did you first pursue Joyce on your own, or because college required you to read it?
I think I first started reading Joyce at school. I may not have got beyond, certainly not beyond A Portrait of the Artist.
In school, meaning in high school or college?
Sorry, in high school, yeah. Sorry.
And what did you start with?
Excuse me?
What Joyce did you start with?
Oh, entry-level Joyce with Dubliners.
Dubliners, yeah.
I'm still very fond of them, and I think Dubliners is very undervalued in the Joycean canon. Sorry.
Yeah. And so then, how do you suss out what does epiphanies and everydayness mean? What was that to you when you heard that's a major pursuit of Joyce?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure that I've ever. Well, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because it's such a kind of crisp and luminous concept. When you come across it theorized in Stephen Hero. But I think in Dubliners and in A Portrait of the Artist, Joyce doesn't actually use the term, does he? He presents you more with a kind of different various localized descriptions of the process, if you see what I mean. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about treating, the notion of epiphany as Stephen defines it in Stephen Hero, as some kind of key to Joyce's work, because I think it both is and isn't. Because otherwise, I think Joyce would have chosen to, publish the theory and, as it were, not put it into the mouth of the character as such.
That's back to that ambiguity factor with the screenwriting teacher and Kubrick. Like, how much do I want to tell? It's basically Edgar Allan Poe inventing the detective novel.
Yeah.
And reasoning backwards, effects precede causes. I'm only going to tell you a little, and then you got to fill in the other stuff.
Yes. That's right.
That gets you trapped in my art. Now you're trapped. I got you.
Yeah. Well, I think Joyce does want us to be collaborate, to cooperate. To participate in the process of, understanding and meaning making. And so he doesn't sort of, he doesn't sort of present you with a decoded formula, but leaves you to kind of experience the sort of subtlety and the ambiguity of all of this.
Yeah. But that's Auden. You mentioned Auden. I love this one. He basically said the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. So, I read Finnegan's Wake with 4 different online Finnegan's Wake reading clubs. And to me, it's the most amazing thing in my life, practically, like to just get involved in this. And then once in a while, I'll sit there going, what the heck? The war and the world's ending, and I'm reading this. What is it going? But I like, no, there's something deeper. I just wrote a whole essay on how Finnegan's Wake is a manifesto for peace. Can art stop war? So it is interesting how much you want to have agenda art.
Yes.
Bertolt Brecht said, I want art that activates us, not puts me in a trance. Well, if it puts you in a trance, maybe it will in the long run activate you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that famous encounter between Joyce and Eisenstein is really interesting in this respect, because, here we've got two of the great experimental artists of the early 20th century. But in terms of sort of human psychology and what you called activation, they couldn't be further apart, because if you look at the way that Einstein's films, for all their brilliance in terms of montage construction and the Kuleshov effect and all of that, at heart they're melodramas, and they're trying to sort of motivate you in a fairly emotionally and intellectually crude manner, I think, rather than allowing for the sort of the subtlety and the reflection that we associate with a novel like Ulysses, which doesn't. I mean, if it has a message, its message is far more indirect and oblique and distributed around the text than the message of, I don't know, October or Battleship Potemkin or whatever, which really hits you over the head, slashes your eyes. The famous image of the spectacles with the blood spurting from the eyes. It's a bit like the overall effect of a film like Battleship Potemkin is it's a sort of assault on the visual cortex in a way that Joyce never really does.
Yeah, Joyce is like tripping on acid, and Eisenstein's like having a bad trip. Like it's a difference between a psychedelic experience. Joyce is like not a bad trip. Eisenstein can be. But did you know this, really quick aside? This filmmaker Alice Guy Blanchet?
Oh yeah.
At age 8, is this a known thing that at age 8, Eisenstein saw one of her films and basically got the Potemkin Odessa Steppe sequence from her film?
Oh, right. I didn't realize that. I know that she directed a lot more films than people realize. That, in a way, she's the sort of the female Georges Méliès.
She is.
Méliès was better at kind of,
No, she got blackballed out of film history. And there's a document. Well, there's a documentary on her, and I wish you could watch it and tell me if that seems accurate, that he got that sequence. And I mean, it's again, like, talk about patriarchy. She gives the most, known cliche scene in the history of cinema, and it's, quoted in Woody Allen films, and everybody knows it. Whether they know the history of cinema, they know the glass and the baby buggy on the steps.
Sure.
But
no, I have to look that up. That's really intriguing. And I wouldn't be at all surprised because there was no Odessa Steppes massacre. It's not a historical fact.
Yeah.
Eisenstein is very good at inventing, as it were, action sequences and grafting them onto historical consciousness in a way that, is completely contrary to, the known facts. The storming of the Winter Palace is in October is another example of that. There was no storming as such. John Reed's account in 10 Days That Shook the World makes that very, very clear. And Reed is a left-leaning writer. He's not in any sense attempting to undermine the Bolshevik cause.
Keith, I'm glad you brought up Ellman, because I just learned this great line. He says, "We are learning to be Joyce's contemporaries."
Yes.
So this statement in regards to what I've learned from studying Frank Zappa and James Joyce is that they both believed all times are happening now, all at
Mm.
onceness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like Wyndham Lewis, be here now, Baba Ram Dass. It's like artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about this. We're learning to be Joyce's contemporaries and the idea of all times are happening now.
Yes, that's really, really interesting. I think the way that Ellman's famous statement's been interpreted, is kind of multi-directional, really, because my own work on Joyce and the sort of visual media of the late 19th century takes one particular tack on that. That Ellman doesn't just mean that Joyce is kind of ahead of us, and that we're still kind of catching up with, this amazing avant-garde vision of, what human culture or what sort of literary representation of our experience could be. We also need to put Joyce back into the historical context of his own time in order to, fully appreciate the the sort of meanings and artistry of his work. So we were talking about Joyce and cinema just now, but I think that the pre-cinematic media that Joyce was exposed to, and which I spent the better part of a decade sort of digging around in order to as it were, unearth the these resonances in his work, were just as important to the way his visual imagination worked as film is, if not more. And they also gave birth to film as well. But because that culture that Joyce was immersed in, for 13 years before the cinematograph came along, has been sort of overlaid by film, sort of obscured by it, remediated by it, we're far less aware of it than we need to be. So we also have to kind of look back into what was contemporary to Joyce in order to kind of become Joyce's contemporaries in this more kind of advanced and forward-looking way. Does that make any sense?
Well, that made a lot of sense because it opened up a lot, Keith. Because one is in study. Well, one is like, Joyce had ESP. Last week we got the word QuickTime in one word. I mean, that's how people send cinema files to me now. It's in QuickTime. Then the word email, and there's all this stuff like, Joyce predicted this stuff, and there's some Joyce scholars I work with that they go, Joyce was not predictive. That's just user as the content. McCone's update to medium is a massage, medium is a message. He just says the user is the content. You can read anything into anything, So, but that's, whether it's predictive or not, I don't know. I have to inject another aside. Have you ever seen Marty Scorsese's documentary on how Cubism affected cinema and how cinema affected Cubism?
A long time ago.
It's 45 minutes and it's on YouTube free, but it's very interesting because, how much did the wake affect cinema? I mean, it's huge, but people don't know the specifics. I have a whole list of the experimental filmmakers who were directly impacted by the wake, but then, it's deeper, like what you're saying, but I'm just wondering what you just said. Is your take on the wake, is it predictive, or I don't know what my question should be. Is it right to treat it as being predictive, or in regards to Ellman learned to be Joyce's contemporary, is he saying, no, don't think of Joyce as predictive, or is Ellman saying, no, think of it both ways?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that we have to be sort of Janus-faced in relation to Joyce.
What are those two words?
Janus-faced.
Janus-faced. Okay. Yeah, both.
the god of doors and
Yeah.
boundaries.
Okay, I got you. You mean do both?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
look both ways simultaneously,
yeah,
as it were, because there's no doubt that, you know,
yeah,
I mean, the famous chapter in Finnegan's Wake where Joyce um, engages with television, you know, which is
yeah,
an incredibly new medium in the 1930s, and
totally.
you know, it's a new technology that you know is sort of embryonic, really. I mean, there are experimental television networks in the UK and other places by the mid 1930s, most of which get switched off, you know, when
Yeah,
the
no, no.
Second
The
World War.
most amazing is to have a TV in a bar. I mean, that's all bars are now is TV
Yeah,
screens.
yeah,
And Joyce has a
absolutely.
TV in a bar. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. There's something almost science fictional about that. And
Yeah,
Finnegan's Wake is one of the few sort of engagements with television and its potentials, one of the few extended engagements
yeah.
outside science fiction in that era.
And that's the amazing thing is I always say Joyce invented the internet and disguised it as a book. But really, Joyce invented what's going to be after the internet. Because
Mm-hmm.
you can't make a movie of Finnegan's Wake, even though Mary Ellen Butte's passages from Finnegan's Wake blew out the New York Finnegan's Wake Reading Club because my friend was there saying the Wake's all about TV, and they go, no, it's not. And then she has the TV sets in the movie and goes, see, and they all went, you're right. Oh my God. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's
But
got some
you're
really interesting aspects to it. I think that partial adaptation.
yeah, but you mean Mary Ellen Butte's film?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Passages from Finnegan's Wake.
Well,
Yeah.
did you know she was a pioneer of abstract electronic animation? And then she
Yes,
made the Wake. Like how appropriate.
it's extremely appropriate. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, she was probably doing Wakean things,
In
uh, you know, without naming it, in her earlier work.
in her abstract animation. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
But your take on the Wake, you're getting it. I know this stupid question, but how much percentage from 0 to 100% do you get the Wake, and how much percentage did Joyce get the Wake? Just, guess.
Well, in my case, I think it's probably about 10%.
Yeah.
In Joyce's case, it's probably about 1,000 or so, because
You would say 1,000. Wow, that's
well,
great.
I mean, I don't think even Joyce, you know, published the Wake with a sense that he could kind of contain its possibilities in his own reading. I think I mean, it's such an amazing machine, you know, for sort of producing puns and wordplay and so on, that I think it's even in excess of its own creator, probably. You know, a bit of a Frankenstein's creature.
Yeah.
In that respect, you know, sort of unleashed on the future.
But isn't that what you're saying then? We call it's a living organism.
Yes. Yes,
Especially because you require people to read it out loud as a group. But you're saying, but when you say then that he didn't, you're saying he got 1,000%. When you say he got it 90%, or you say he got it 100%, but he knew the potential of him not knowing what's going to come up.
Yes, I think so. I think
is endless. He knew that he created this endless Mobius strip that it's going to go on. Yeah,
definitely. I think that sort of that potential is inexhaustible, really, isn't it? And it's deliberately so. So, you know, even, well, you know, D.H. Lawrence always used to say, "Never trust the artist, trust the tale," and that, you know, the kind of, you know, it's a version of the intentional fallacy, isn't it? But I think Joyce probably rejoiced in, you know, in not subscribing to the intentional fallacy, and in, you know, kind of animating the wake and leaving it to get on with its own work.
You mean that DH said, never trust the artist, trust the tale, that
Yeah.
Joyce was flipping that and saying, I know, no, what was he saying? I didn't get that, not subscribing to the fallacy. What does that mean again?
Well, the intentional fallacy that, you know, the artist is fully kind of in control of the, you know, the sort of meaning of their own work and can set a boundary around it.
Right. If you could ask Joyce a question now from the grave and he could answer it, what would you ask him?
Wow. Well, there's so much that you could ask him, really. Yeah. I'm just trying to think if there are particular unanswered questions in my own work. But, you know, I'd have to sit him down, I think, and it would be a long conversation. I don't think it wouldn't be a one-word question. Sorry, it wouldn't be a one-sentence question.
Yeah.
I don't think it could be a one-word answer either.
Right. It's a long. And then the Keith is and then the key is, would you believe him?
Yeah. I'd certainly like to ask him about magic lanterns. And
yes. Oh my God. I wanted to go there because I just saw magic lanterns used at the Ann Arbor Film Festival last week.
Fabulous.
Look at it's only a 130-year-old medium. They've been an experimental film festival for 62 years. There I am sitting in this 20s movie palace, and to the side of me, this woman's running 2 magic lanterns. I'm like, what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, if you've got two lanterns, or at least 2 lenses on a lantern, or possibly even more, the number of combined moving and dissolve effects you can produce is endless, really.
Oh, she had 2. She had 2, and she used the smoke thing. I was like, how is this? The smoke thing was amazing.
Was she projecting onto smoke?
I don't know, but you could see the smoke moving, you know, without control. What do you call that?
Fantastic. Yeah, swirling, I suppose.
Swirling on the big screen.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Oh, it was
in Phantasmagorias, it was quite common to project, you know, images of spooks onto smoke. And there's even there's a moment in Dracula where Dracula appears, you know, materializes from a kind of column of mist in someone's bedroom, and that's probably based on Stoker's knowledge of the use of projection effects onto smoke. You know, in the Phantasmagoria tradition, because of course he was a theater impresario as well as as well as a writer.
Yeah. Amazing. Because I know you wanted to end, so we can end, but I hope you will allow me to do more in a months down the line of part 2, because we barely scratched the surface on Joyce, let alone cinema, let alone Joyce in cinema, because that's really one of my main things is experimental cinema. And then I sort of got into Joyce after that. Right. And now it's really amazing, the crossover. Like, just, have you ever seen the Green Pastures movie?
That rings a bell.
It's a all black cast American movie that's
I think it might be under it might have a different title in the UK, but and
it's amazing because I'm in the midst of spending a week at this experimental film festival, and then I go to where I'm staying at my cousin's house in Michigan, and he has TCM, Turner Classics Movies, which I never watch, but I love to watch the old movies. And I'd never seen Green Pastures, and it comes on. I'm like, oh my God. And you can,
amazing, isn't it?
It reeks of Finnegan's Wake. You can just see Joyce watching it going, oh, I'm going to put that in my movie.
I remember seeing it as a kid, actually. I knew that it rang a very distant bell. It might have a slightly different title in the UK. I mean, that's
it could. I mean, just
happens. But
make
it's basically the Bible, isn't it? Sort of narrated with a
you can watch it free on Vimeo now. Just
very, very sort of expressionist from what I recall
oh
in the
yeah.
use of sets and so on, highly
And
stylized.
I mean, it's one of these things that's not predictive or guessing. Joyce had to have seen this because there's really distinct. You know,
Yeah.
he says the guy who plays three roles, Rex Ingram, he says it in the wake, and then there's very distinct things. One other thing, Keith, before we close out is have you ever seen this book called Haunted Media?
Oh yeah, Jeffrey Sconce. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I figured you did. Yeah. Because
Sure.
nothing more like Wakey, and then the guy shoots his TV set and his wife calls the cops and they show up and they go, there's no law against shooting your TV. Because
we've all wanted to do that, or rather it's the people, you know, it's the figures that appear on it that you want to shoot sometimes.
Right. But it's the thing that, you know, he thinks that the TV's talking to him. I mean, now that is all, it's all TV, which is what we participated in, is we're on telephone.
Yes.
And did you know that first appeared kind of in reality in 1939, the year The Wake came out, at the New York World's Fair.
Oh, right. There was a practical demonstration of a telephonoscope, as they might have called
it. And then when did it become a reality to a lot of people was 2001, A Space Odyssey by Kubrick, when he calls his daughter from the spaceship and wishes her a happy birthday. And it's like, wow, television. Now that's all my life is Zoom sessions on telephone.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this lost science fiction writer, his work is full of devices of that kind, you know, where people are telepresencing across global distances, or even, you know, using devices to sort of intervene telekinetically, or to teleport themselves, or, you know, project their consciousness across the world. You know, this is back in the 1880s and 1890s.
And you're talking Robert Duncan Hill?
No, his surname, it's a very distinctively Scottish surname, and it's local to this area because he was born about 10 miles away from here. So the spelling is Milne.
You mean that's his name that he writes under?
Yes. Yeah, that was his given name as well, the name that he was born with. So Robert Duncan Milne. It's about the. Oh,
it's not Hill. I'm sorry, I missed.
No.
The last name is Milne.
Yeah, that's right, Milne.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're unfamiliar, I mean, to me, it's a very familiar surname because I've had loads of students with that surname. Yeah. And obviously, you know, we've been working on this project to reclaim his lost writing for, you know, at least a decade.
Yeah.
So the first critical edition of his work is coming out next year with Bloomsbury in February.
Great. Yeah.
So
that's really important. And we didn't even get into H.G. Wells, but I have to ask you one quick question. My friend who studied science fiction deeply and political research says that most of the science fiction writers worked for the man or the secret police, in that, you know, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, up to Philip K. Dick, who admitted, you know, the CIA have controlled my mind. And it sounds like a kooky conspiracy theory, but did H.G. Wells have connections with the government?
Well, he certainly worked for the Ministry of Information, I think, both in the Great War and in the Second World War, and he had connections with you know, high-ranking politicians. Churchill, for example, even though Churchill was on a different part of the political spectrum, he and Wells you know, interacted for decades, and you know, were kind of trading ideas with each other. Wells also, you were talking about Joyce kind of foreseeing the internet in Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Wells writes that series of essays, publishes that series of essays in 1937, 2 years before the Wake's published, which is called The World Brain. And it's basically a kind of imagining of, you know, some kind of global information system that you can run a sort of world encyclopedia on.
Yeah.
You know, a bit like the Wikipedia idea.
Yeah.
But sort of
the world brain is a type of internet. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's what is the internet if not, you know, the world brain?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Keith, thank you so much. I've really learned a lot, and it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I appreciate all your time. And I'll send you some dates, and maybe we can book part 2. Thank you again. Yeah.
My pleasure. I'd certainly enjoy you know, speaking with you again. That was great fun.
Really cool. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Fantastic. I look forward to the next session.
Thank you, Keith.
Cheers. Bye-bye.